All right, so now we're at the Annales Cambriae book. And so this is going to give us a better understanding of who the exact strata of Vikings who were referred to as the quote unquote Dub Genti were. And this is just going to bolster my statement even more that the Dub Genti were in fact people of color, and they were called the Dub Genti due to them being of quote unquote dark skin color, not quote unquote dark hair color. So now let's just read this entry right here in the Annales Cambriae Welsh Chronicle historical book, starting at 987. So this is in Latin, of course, so bear with me. So from right here, Annos Godred Filius Radi Cum Negris. Now this is going to be the word that I'm going to do a bit of an investigation on. Okay, this term Negris and other words that derive from the same root word as this word Negris. Okay, so this is going to be the word that we examine in a little bit here. But let's just keep reading. Gentibilis, Bastavit, Mon, Captis, Dubus, Millibus, Homonym. So we can skip over some of this. Let me see here. Alright, I'm going to start from right about here. So Anos, Meredat, Redimic, Captivos, Gentibilis, Negris. So once again, that term Negris, we see that term being brought up again in this second entry. So now, of course, once again, this is in Latin. So let's get an English translation of what these entries are saying, so we can get a better understanding. All right. So now we're back in the Origins of the Anglo-Saxon book, and this is going to give an English translation of the entry that we just read in the Annales Cambriae book. So now let's read what this has to say. Let's start from right about here. There is an interesting record of the descent of dark sea rovers on the coast of North Wales in the Annales Cambriae under the year 987. So that's the year that we just read. So which tells us that Gothred, son of Harold, with black men, devastated Anglesia and captured 2,000 men. Another entry, so this is the second entry that we read after the first one. But another entry in the same record tells us that Merodot redeemed the captives from the black men. Okay, so right here we can see the term black men. So obviously this is going to be, or this should be an indicator of what the word that I pointed out, the word negris. This should be an indicator of what that word means, right? That being black or black men. That's what that term negris was in reference to. Okay? But now let's just look at these two names right here. So now, Gothred, son of Harold. So now, this person right here, Harold, I believe he was Harold Clack of the Jutland Peninsula. So he was a quote-unquote Jutlandish or Danish king. So the Jutland Peninsula, that was a province or an area in Denmark. So he was a quote unquote Dane. Okay, so Harold the Dane, right? And so his son Gothred must have also have been a Dane. Okay, so I hope you guys are starting to understand what I'm saying here. So the Danes are the quote unquote black men, or the Dub Genti, who I've been speaking about. So those are the specific strata of Vikings that were referred to as the quote unquote Dub Genti. Okay, and another way that we can glean that these are in fact the Danes is that for the people who watched the informational portion of this series, hopefully a lot of you did, but for those of you who didn't, you'll remember that I mentioned in there that the Danes invaded the islands of Anglesey and Gwynedd. Those were two Welsh kingdoms, and they invaded those kingdoms in 854. from about 854 to around 856, I believe, is when they when the Danes first invaded Wales, and of course they were stopped by Rodri Mar. But anyway, but yeah, so those were Danes that invaded those two islands when they first came into Wales. And so just as it was back in 854 when they invaded Wales, so it is now. It's the same group of people who had a history of invading Wales. Okay? So it's the Danes that were the quote-unquote dub Genti. Okay, so but let's go back to that word Negris, and let's get a better understanding of what the true definition of the term Negris is. Alright, so now we're on the Word Sense Dictionary website. So now as we can see, Negris, Latin, noun, negris, inflection of negere. Now this is going to be a word that I'm going to delve into in much greater depth in a little bit here. Okay, because this is a very important word right here. But as we can see, it's an inflection of this term negere. Okay, so now let's look at what the term negere means. So negere, also a Latin word. Okay, so today we would look at this word and pronounce it as Niger. Or we look at this word and it would look like it's pronounced Niger. But as this states, this is a Latin word or a Latin term. So the proper pronunciation for this word would be niger. Okay, niger. Because in the Latin language, they have a much different sounding alphabet than us, especially their vowel sounds. So of course our vowel sounds are A, E, I, O, U. But in Latin, the vowel sounds are A, E, U, and Okay, so the I in quote unquote Niger actually makes an E sound. So it's Niger. Okay, so Niger is how that word is pronounced. But let's look at the definition of Niger. So origin and history from Niger, black, dark. Okay. So black, dark is what the term Niger means. And as I've already shown, Negris is just a inflection or just another form of the word Niger. So it means pretty much the same thing. It means black or dark. Okay. I drop down here, proper noun, Niger, masculine, genitive, Negri, Roman agnomen, or nickname. So a name that was applied to somebody. Okay. Let's look at another definition of the word Niger, or Negris, I should say. So now we're on the House of Names website. You guys should check this website out. It's a pretty good website. But let's read this little paragraph up here, and let's see what it defines the word Niger as meaning. So from this historical and fascinating Italian region have emerged a multitude of noble families, including the distinguished Negris family. Italian people were originally known by a single name, but it became necessary to adopt a second name as populations grew and travel became more frequent. The surname Negris is derived from the Italian word negri, which means black. It was most likely originally a nickname for someone with a dark complexion, perhaps for an immigrant from northern Africa. So as we can see, once again, the term Negris comes from the word negri. Okay, all the word negri means is black. So Negris and negri, they both come from the same root, that being Niger. Okay, all these words just mean black. All right, so now let's look at one last definition of the term Negris. So now we're on the Wiktionary website. So now Negris, passive negri. Now let's see what negri means. So negri, present negras, past negris, future negros, conditional negrus, volutive negru, and transitive to be black in color. Related terms negra, black, negru, a black color. Now let's see what the term negru means. Okay, obviously negru once again means black. And now let's look at the related terms. So related terms, Negro. All right. So now we can start to see just how connected all these words are, and the fact that they all come from the same root and that they all mean the same thing. So obviously, Negro, that was a term that was applied to black people more often in the 1940s and the 1950s and even into the 1960s, some into the 1970s, but mainly around that time period from 1940 to 1960 was the time period that black people were referred to as quote unquote Negroes. Okay, and that once again that was a term that was strictly applied to blacks or to black people. Okay, so once again, Negro is of the same derivation, or it's of the same. It's a derivative of the same word as Negris. Okay, all these words are just words that apply to so-called black people. All right, and as we can see, other words: negra, black; negri, to be black. So now let's look at the etymology of the term. Which one is this? This is negro. Let's look at the etymology of the term. So etymology 1, from Niger, black. Okay. So all these words just mean black. All right, and I got news for you. Even that other word, the word that is a bit more offensive, right? That being the quote unquote N word. I'm not going to say the actual word because I don't want to get flagged for my first video series. But the quote unquote N word, that word does derive from Niger. All right. I got news for you. That word is a word that's been applied to blacks, or that black people have called each other for thousands of years. Okay. Obviously, it's taken on a different connotation now since quote unquote slavery times. But please understand that I believe, as I already stated earlier, words and meanings of words have had their definitions changed over time. So, but the etymology of the word is the most important thing to look at so that we can get a better understanding of what certain words mean and why they were applied to certain people. Like, for example, you had back during the time period of Alexander the Great, one of his most potent military leaders or generals was a man by the name of Cletus Niger. All right, so Cletus Niger, spelled just like how this looks right here, was also known as Cletus the Black. Okay, so Cletus the Black, he was, if he was alive today, we'd call him a so-called black man or a black person. Okay, but that term Niger was applied to him because he was in fact a black man or a black person. Okay, so and that was all the way back a couple hundred years before Christ was alive, or when Christ came to earth. Okay, so even going all the way back then, that term Niger was applied to so-called black people. Okay, and then I think I mentioned earlier Kenneth Dubb. I remember Kenneth Dubb. Another name for him was Kenneth the Niger Dubb. Okay, so Kenneth the Black. That was his name, and that was what he was referred to as. So once again, that name was a that's a name that has always been applied to so-called black people, and that's even a name that blacks have applied to themselves, or that they've called themselves for thousands of years. And I know that may sound controversial, but I'll go about proving that very briefly right now. All right, so now let's just look at this real quick. So in classic antiquity, Afer, Moras, Niger, Atur, Fuscus, remember this term fuscus? Fuscus just means black or dark. All right. Perustas or melas were commonly used in reference to darker tone physical characteristics encountered in daily life around the Mediterranean. The term Aethios referred to particularly dark-skinned peoples first recorded as early as Homer, for whom they were remote, almost legendary figures that inhabited the far reaches of the known world. So once again, all these words right here are meant to be in reference to so-called black people right here. Okay, of course it says in reference to quote-unquote darker tone physical characteristics, but all that really means is just a black person. But you'll have some people who will try and make this term out to mean somebody who's slightly tan colored or who may have some sort of quote-unquote color in their skin, right, as meaning darker tone, but nah, this is in reference to black people, because this term right here, moros. So this word is where you get a lot of the words that were used in the medieval time period, like the word Moor, spelled Moor, that primarily referred to black people, right? Like for example, in one of Shakespeare's plays named Othello, which is literally about a black military leader, if I'm not mistaken, or a black military commander. He referred to Othello as a Moor. He was referred to as a Moor over and over again. Right? And then some people out there may even know the Moors, the Muslim Moors that existed during, I think, like the 7th century, all the way to like the 14th or the 15th century, out there in Spain, if I'm not mistaken. So a lot of y'all probably already know those people already. But once again, that term Moor, that derives from this word right here, mortis, which just means black. It literally means black. Okay, it's a Latin word, just like all these other words, and it means black. That's all it means. Okay, and then even last names too, like Morris, Murray, Moreau, Moore, like the last name Moore with M, spelled Moore. That derives from this word right here, Morris or Moras. Okay. So just to let you guys know, in order for us to really understand our true and exact history, we have to be able to go back and look at words and phrases that might be offensive or even what could be deemed as derogatory today towards us. But we have to look back and look at and investigate the etymology of these words so that we can get a proper understanding of why certain people were called these words in history, because there are a lot of so-called black historical figures that have this moniker of Nigger by their name. Okay? And so obviously that's meant to be indicative of them being so-called black people, right? And not just having darker hair or whatever, or dark eyes, which is what most people were trying to make this word out to mean whenever somebody is referred to as a Nigger. But once we understand the etymology, and once we understand that words like Negro, which strictly mean a so-called black person, derived from this word, then we can get a better understanding of why that person was called the Nigger or what have you. Okay, because they were so-called black. So now I just want to do a very, very brief investigation into that word, into the quote unquote N word. And no, I'm not doing it to be offensive or anything. I just want to even further prove my argument, or this is going to help even further prove my argument that the term Negris was in reference to the Danish Vikings being so-called black people. So now let's look at this term, the N-word, real quick. Once again, this isn't to offend anybody. I'm just trying to prove even further to you guys that these words mean the same thing, and that they've always meant that they've always been applied to so-called black people. So now let's look at this real quick. Let's start from right about here. The word originated in the 18th century as an adaptation of the Spanish word negro, a descendant of the Latin adjective niger. Okay? So once again, niger, negro. There's another French form of this word, niger. I believe it's pronounced negre. Okay, all those words derive from this same word, niger, which just means, as this states right here, black. Okay, and I know I'm gonna get a lot of people that say, or that try to wax poetic about race, and they try to, it's funny how when you see certain people on the internet trying to defend a certain narrative about what certain people in history looked like, and when there's like a documentation that refutes that narrative, they try and refute what the term actually means by stating that it just means something else that it doesn't really mean. Like, for example, like this term niger. There are people that try and even make this word niger out to mean something other than somebody who's a so-called black person who has so-called skin color, and they'll use the same frivolous argument having to do with hair or eye color, right? And then they'll start to wax poetic about how back in that time period, black wasn't a race, and black people, how black people define being quote-unquote black today wasn't the same back then, and they're correct, actually. But what you have to understand is that when it talks about somebody being called black, or when it describes somebody as being black, it's not describing their race. It's not describing their descent or their lineage. It's describing their physical characteristics, right? Or it's describing their physical, what they look like, right? Their skin tone or their complexion, etc. That's what this term, the black, or whenever this moniker niger or the black is applied to somebody, it's in reference to what they looked like or their physical characteristics. All right. So, but let's just move on real quick here. So we don't need to look at that. Let's just look at and just see the etymology real quick. So here we go. Alteration of the earlier, I'm not going to say that, that's too close. But from Middle French, negre, from Spanish or Portuguese, negro, from negro, black, from Latin, niger. So once again, the N word does in fact derive from niger. All means the same thing. Okay, so this is going to be the last one that I do. So, negar, neger, from French negre, from Spanish negro, sin negros. Now let's see the term negro. So once again, member of a black-skinned race of Africa, from Spanish or Portuguese negro, black, from Latin negrum, nominative of niger, black, dark, sable, dusky. Oh, so now look, we see the term dusky being aligned with the term negro, and the definitions of the term negro, right? Black, dark, sable, dusky. So once again, when I mentioned about the dusky-skinned Picts and Scots, right? When Gildas called the Picts and the Scots, quote unquote, dusky-skinned, he was calling them that because they looked like this term right here, like a Negro, like a so-called black person. Okay, that's why that term is aligned with Negro. But once again, we see that this term Negro is a nominative or a derivative, or is derivative of the term Niger. Okay, and Negro obviously has a or really Negro is just the ancestor word of the N word. Okay, so but they all come from the same root word, that being this ancient Latin word neger. Okay, they all come from the same root and they all mean the same thing. So just going back to Negris, Negris, as I've already proven, all that means is just a black person or somebody who's of a black-skinned appearance or complexion. All right. So now let's just look at another chronicle from the Annales Cambriae book, just to prove even further that the Danes were in fact the quote-unquote Dub Genti or Black Gentiles. So now let's read this entry from 866, from the year 866 in the Annales Cambriae book. All right, so the city of York was laid waste. That is the battle with the Black Gentiles. So now once again, for those of you who watch the informational portion of this series, you'll remember that I believe I went over the Danes' arrival into Anglo-Saxon England. Okay, so they arrived in Anglo-Saxon England in 865, and they invaded the kingdom of East Anglia first, and then in 866, the year after that, they ventured off to Northumbria, the kingdom of Northumbria, and they invaded Northumbria, and they took its capital, York, which they eventually would call Jorvik, and I believe even to this day, York is still referred to as Jorvik. But so they took the capital York, and as this says right here, it was laid to waste by the quote-unquote Black Gentiles, who, and this is just referencing the Danish heathen army, or the Great Heathen Army. Okay, the Great Heathen Army was led by who? Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan Haraldsson. Okay, those were two sons of the legendary Danish Viking leader known as Ragnar Lodbrok. Okay, so once again, these were Danes, the quote-unquote Dub Genti or Black Gentiles. These were Danes. Okay, so now let's just see. Let's just look at another name that was applied to the quote-unquote Dub Genti or the Danes, just to even further prove that these were in fact the Dub Genti. Okay, this is going to be Norse Dublin. Let's start from right about here. Our title, Norse Dublin, requires some explanation. Danes, Dinar, or Dub Gaul. So the word Dub Gaul means black foreigners. Okay, so this was the word that the Irish applied to the Danish Vikings. Okay, so they were called the Dub Gaul, and then the Norwegians were Lachlana or Fingal, and they were mingled in the Scandinavians who invaded our island. But it is the opinion of the great scholar Bouget, and now generally accepted, that the greater part of our invaders, and certainly their rulers, were Norwegian, and of the same stock who settled in Iceland, Greenland, the Scottish Isles, and Man, the Norse being apparently fairer, and the Danes darker. The Irish, who had a strong sense of color, called the former the fair foreigners. Okay, Fingal, and the Danes dark foreigners, Dubgal. So, once again, even this author right here, Edmund Curtis, even he is giving you an understanding that the Danes were darker. Not that they had darker hair or darker eye color, but that they were just darker than the Fingal or the fair foreigners. Okay. So once again, this is just another piece of evidence to corroborate the fact that the Danes were in fact so-called black. They were the Black Gentiles or the black foreigners. Okay. So that's all that does. It just bolsters the argument even more. But so now that we've established that the Danes were in fact the Dub Genti or the Dub Gaul, let's go about finding out what exactly the Danes, or who exactly the Danes were. Okay. All right. So now let's look at who the Danes are. Let's look at what tribe the Danes belong to. So now let's read this. So the Danes were a North Germanic tribe inhabiting southern Scandinavia, including the area now comprising Denmark proper and the Scandinavian provinces of modern-day southern Sweden during the Nordic Iron Age and the Viking Age. So as we can see here, the Danes were a North Germanic tribe. Okay, now the Germanic tribes were the aboriginal people of the country that we call today, of course, Germany. Okay, so now the Danes were a descendant of the North Germanic peoples. But now let's go about proving real quick here that not only the Danes but the other Scandinavian tribes, that being the people of Sweden and Norway, were also descended from the quote-unquote Northern or North Germanic people. Okay, so North Germanic peoples, commonly called Scandinavians, Nordic peoples, and in a medieval context, Norsemen, are a Germanic ethno-linguistic group of the Nordic countries. They are identified by their cultural similarities, common ancestry, and common use of the Proto-Norse language from around 200 AD, a language that around 800 AD became the Old Norse language, which in turn later became the North Germanic languages of today. So once again, the Northern Germanic peoples, those were just one of the sections of Germanic peoples, because you had North Germanic peoples, you had West Germanic peoples. So I believe the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes derived from the quote-unquote West Germanic peoples, and then you had the Franks as well, who I believe were also a Western Germanic group, and then the Eastern Germanics also as well. So you had other subsections of quote-unquote Germanic peoples, but once again, the Germanic peoples, they were just the aboriginal people of Germany. Okay, now let's just go about proving that real quick. And I'm going somewhere with this, so bear with me. So ancient history. Germanic peoples occupied much of the present-day territory of Germany in ancient times. The Germanic peoples are those who spoke one of the Germanic languages, and they thus originated as a group with the so-called first sound shift, Grimm's Law, which turned a Proto-Indo-European dialect into a Proto-Germanic dialect within the Indo-European language family. So once again, Germanic peoples, ancient people of the modern-day Germany, or the modern-day territory of quote-unquote Germany, okay? So the ancient peoples of Germany were the ancestors of, or were the people who the Vikings or the Scandinavians derived from, okay? So now that we have that straightened out, let's look at another methodology that is going to help us gain a better understanding of the Germanic peoples and what exactly the Germanic peoples even looked like. Okay. So now this is going to be the Cephalic Index. So this was a methodology that anthropologists would use. Anthropologists mainly from the 18th century, or like the late 1700s, into like the 19th century or the 1800s would use to try and figure out what certain people, or what a group of skeletons that they would find, particularly a skull of a person that they would find. They would use the breadth and the length, or the length and the width of the skull, to figure out whether or not a certain person that they found belonged to a certain ethnic group. Okay, but let's just read this little brief description of what the Cephalic Index is. So Cephalic Index, the percentage of breadth to length in any skull. The index is calculated from measurement of the diameters of the skull. This length of the skull is the distance from the glabella, the midpoint between the brows, and the most projecting point at the back of the head. The breadth of the skull is the distance between the most projecting points at the side of the head, usually a little bit above and behind the ears. The Cephalic Index is the breadth multiplied by 100 divided by the length. So that just gives us an understanding of what the quote-unquote Cephalic Index is. Once again, it's just a methodology that was used, and that's still used to this day, mainly with more with animals. But it was a methodology that was used to figure out what a certain person's skull, like if they found a person's skull in like in like a European country, if they found the skull of an ancient Aboriginal person that settled in that country, they would examine the skull, and they would examine the as it says up here, the breadth and the length, to figure out whether or not that person belonged to the Aboriginal people of that land or not. Okay. So now let's just pay attention to what the designations are of these different skulls, and what the terminologies are used in association with these designations as well, and what the main group of people are, or who the main group of people are who are associated with these designations as well. So now let's read this right here. An index of less than 75 means that the skull is long and narrow. When seen from the top, such skulls are called dolichocephalic. So remember this word right here, dolichocephalic. And just going back up, it says right here, an index of less than 75 means that the skull is long and narrow. Okay, so remember those two terminologies associated with dolichocephalic, long and narrow. Okay, so dolichocephalic means long, narrow. Okay, so and are typical of Australian Aborigines and native Southern Africans. Now the Australian Aborigines, are so-called black people. Okay, and that's not really that controversial. You can look up who are the indigenous people, or who are the original people of Australia, and it will bring up a picture of so-called black people with straight blonde hair. Okay, because they have like straighter hair, or straighter hair texture than a lot of so-called blacks from like Africa and even out here. So, but they are so-called black people. And then the native Southern Africans. So that's in reference to the San tribesmen, spelled S-A-N, and then tribesmen. Okay, another name for them is the Bushmen, B-U-S-H-M-E-N, Bushmen. Okay, and just as an aside, they are, according to geneticists, they are the oldest living civilization on the planet Earth today. Okay, so they're the oldest surviving civilization on the planet Earth right now. So just remember these two designations right here: the Black Australian Aborigines and the Black Native Southern Africans. Those are the two groups of people that are mainly associated with the dolichocephalic Cephalic Index skull designation. Okay, and then once again, just to review, long and narrow equals dolichocephalic, and then the two people that are associated with dolichocephalic are the Australian Aborigines and the native Southern Africans. Okay, so now let's just read further. So an index of 75 to 80 means that the skull is nearly oval, and such skulls are called metacephalic and are typical of Europeans and the Chinese. So of course, when we see here Europeans and Chinese, so the Europeans, of course, are in reference to the quote-unquote Europeans of today, but that's not in reference to the Aboriginal Europeans. Okay, so but that's another story for another day. But the Europeans of today, they're not the descendants of the Aboriginal Europeans. Please understand that. Okay, so the Europeans and the Chinese. So the Europeans and the Chinese, or the so-called Caucasian Europeans and the Chinese, have been proven to be genetically similar to one another. Okay, so the fact that they're associated under the same skull index on the Cephalic Index just further substantiates that they're in fact of the same genetic stock or what have you. So, but that's another story for another day. But now let's look at this second skull designation that we're about to read, and let's look at the words or the terminologies that are associated with, as well as the people as well. So a skull having an index of over 80 is broad and short. So remember those two terms, broad and short. Okay, broad and short, associated with brachycephalic. Okay, so remember this term right here, brachycephalic. Okay, so such skulls are common among Mongolians and the Andaman Islanders. Now, the topic of the Mongolians is a rather controversial one. Well, at least how I'm about to define the Mongolians is going to be relatively controversial. Okay, because when you think of Mongolians, you think, of course, people from China, or quote unquote Chinese people, as being the Mongolians, or the ancient Mongolians. But what has to be understood, for number one, is that the founder of the Mongol Empire in 1206, one of the biggest empires in the history of the world, Genghis Khan, he was related to a man by the name of Wang Khan, spelled W-A-N-G, and then Khan, which was basically like the leader of a tribe, or the chief of a tribe, or like an emperor. So in Wang Khan was the Khan of another Mongol tribe by the name of the Karaites, spelled K-E-R-A-I-T-E-S. Okay, so the Karaites, and in the Mongolian and Turkish tongue, the word Karaite quite literally means black or swarthy. Now, as I've already stated earlier, I believe the word swarthy just means dark skin. Okay, the word swarthy is just another word for dark skin, as I'm going to prove a little bit later. So, but the word Karaite in the Turkish and the Mongolian tongue quite literally mean black or swarthy. Okay, and so the founders of this clan, of the Karaite clan, or at least one of the founders of the Karaite clan, were 8 Mongolian brothers who were described as, and I quote, having unusually dark faces. Okay, so they had quote unquote dark or black faces. So those were so-called black people. Okay, those were so-called black people, and the descendants of this clan, that being the uncle of Genghis Khan, because the man that I referenced earlier, who was related to Genghis Khan, Wang Khan was the uncle of Genghis Khan. Okay, so and that was by way of his father. That was by way of Genghis Khan's father, Yasugwe, I believe his name is Yasugwe. Okay, so Genghis Khan and the Mongols, those were black people. Okay, and once again, I know a lot of people are gonna try to come against that, or a lot of people may be against what I just stated, but Genghis Khan and the Mongols, or at least a certain section of the Mongols, which include Genghis Khan's constituency, right? Because once again, his father was related to the group of people that I just mentioned, the Karaites, who were described as being black or swarthy, or at least that's what their name entails. And then the founders of that Mongol tribe were described as having unusually dark faces. So those were so-called black people. All right, and if Genghis Khan is related to somebody of that tribe, closely related, I might add, to somebody of that tribe, that must make him a so-called black man as well. Okay, or at least partially a so-called black man. And and by the way, his grandson Kublai Khan, the founder of the city of Beijing, of the Chinese city of Beijing, was also described as being swarthy. Okay, which just means dark skin. So once again, the Mongolians, that's in reference to the ancient Mongolians. That's more in reference to the ancient Mongolians, okay? And as I already stated, and as I'm going to prove in a much, much later video, the Mongolians were in fact so-called black people, okay? Or at least the subsection that I just mentioned, those were so-called black people, all right? And so the next group of people, the Andaman Islanders. So the Andaman Islanders, those are in reference to and that's in reference to a group of people known as the Andaman Negritos. That's another name for them, the Andaman Negritos, which the word negrito just means the same thing basically as pygmy, which means little dark person. Okay, or a little black person is what that word negrito means. And once again, you can go and look these people up, and you'll clearly see that they're so-called black people. Okay, so the two groups of people who are associated with the brachycephalic designation, or the broad and short designation, those are also two ethnic groups of so-called black people. Okay, so brachycephalic, broad and short, equals the black Mongolians and the black Andaman Islanders. And then dolichocephalic, just to review, dolichocephalic, or long and narrow, are associated with the black Australian Aborigines and the native South Africans, or the natives of South Africa. Okay, so remember those two things, and what they're associated with. Okay. So now I just want to prove real quick here that what I just stated about the Mongols is actually true. And once again, this is going to be something that I go into in much greater depth later on, in a later video series that'll probably be as extensive as 4 volumes. I know I normally have 3 volumes, but that will probably have to be 4, because that's going to be very extensive. So let me just prove real quick. Alright, so let's start from right about here, or I'll read from right about here. This is no uncommon practice with them, and shows how habit among these nomads has become a second nature. Dr. Williams gives us a correct description of the physical appearance of these Mongols, so let's pay attention. He says the Mongol tribes generally are a stout, squat, swarthy, ill-favored race of men having high and broad shoulders, short, broad noses, pointed and prominent chins, long teeth, distant from each other, eyes black, elliptical, etc. So once again, they're described as being quote-unquote swarthy, okay, swarthy or dark-skinned. All right, so but once again, that's going to be a completely different story for another day. Let me just move on. All right, so now we're on a book that was written by a man by the name of Thomas Huxley. Now, Thomas Huxley was a very, very heavily regarded and revered, I believe, biologist, as well as a lot of other things. He was like a polymath, or somebody who was very adept at multiple things. So, but he was a highly regarded and highly revered biologist back in his day, which was, I believe, around like the 18th century, if I'm not mistaken, or the 1700s into the 18th century, or the 1800s, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. So, but he utilized the Cephalic Index as well for a lot of his findings. So now let's read what he has to say about certain people that he was able to find in Germany, right? Because we're looking at the Germanic tribes, who were the ancestors of the Scandinavians, right? So let's look at what he has to say about these skulls of the people of Germany, as well as some of the skulls that he found even in Denmark as well, that will further substantiate my point. So, but let's start from right about here. So far as the present evidence goes, they appear to have comprised both broad and long heads of moderate stature. Okay, so once again, we should know by now what these terms are associated with. So broad is brachycephalic, and long heads is dolichocephalic, right? So dolichocephalic, i.e., people along the lines of the Australian Aborigines and the South African San tribesmen are the long heads, and then the broadheads, or the brachycephalic people, are people along the lines of the Mongolians, as well as the Andaman Negritos. Okay, so those are the two people that we should be looking at whenever we see these two designations. But let's keep reading. So in France, England, and Germany, both long and broad skulls are found in tumuli belonging to the Neolithic stage. So Neolithic is like the Stone Age. It's like the latter stages of the Stone Age. But as we can see, Thomas Huxley states that the skulls that they found of the people of Germany as well as England and France were long and broad, i.e. dolichocephalic and brachycephalic. Okay? So once again, those should be associated with the Australian Aborigines and the Mongolians or the Black Mongolians and the Andaman Negritos. Okay? So in some parts of England, the long skulls, and in other the broad skulls accompany the higher stature. Okay, so now let's read what he has to say about the Scandinavian Peninsula and particularly the people of Denmark as well. So in the Scandinavian Peninsula, 9/10 of the Neolithic or Stone Age people are decided long or dolichocephalic heads. Okay. So in the Scandinavian Peninsula, i.e. where the Scandinavian tribes settled at, right, the people of Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, 9/10, so most of the Neolithic or ancient Stone Age people that settled in that region were long heads, okay, or dolichocephalic. And then the people of Denmark, or in Denmark, there is a much larger proportion of broad heads, so brachycephalic, i.e. Mongolians and Andaman Negritos, okay? So once again, this bolsters my statement that the ancient people of Germany as well as the ancient people of Denmark and even in the Scandinavian Peninsula were in fact people of color. But let's look at something else real quick. Let's look at another article written by I believe he was a physician, a man by the name of John Crawford. Okay, so let's start from right about here. So, but the theory seems to me completely overthrown by the fact that among most of the races of man, skulls are found of both descriptions. So when he says most of the races of man, he's talking about the aboriginal people, or the aboriginal races of man, i.e. the ancient races of man. So let's keep reading. Of the 7 skulls found in the kist of Caithness, and so carefully and skillfully described by Professor Huxley himself. So once again, he's referencing Professor Huxley. 5 turned out, as tested by the cephalic scale, to be short, and 5 to be long. So once again, short equals brachycephalic, and then long equals dolichocephalic. Okay, so now, but let's back up real quick, because he mentioned a region in Scotland right here by the name of Caithness. So Caithness is I believe it's an island near northern Scotland, around the area of Orkney, which is an archipelago in northern Scotland. Okay, so now, for those of you who remember, I mentioned the Picts, who were one of the aboriginal or ancient people of Scotland, and they were described as being, by the 6th century British monk Gildas, as being dusky, or dusky skinned, right, or a duskish swarm of vermin, referring to their skin color or what they looked like physically. Okay, and as we saw earlier, the term dusky was associated with the word negro and all the other words that went along with the word negro. All right, which of course is in reference to a black person. So the term duskish or dusky skin was meant to intonate that the people of the Picts were so-called black people. And so, as I stated, the Picts, they mainly resided in northern Scotland. And as I just stated, Caithness was an island in northern Scotland. So most likely the skulls that this person is referencing, that John Crawford is referencing, were skulls of the duskish swarm of Picts, right, or the black swarm of Picts. All right. So as he stated right here, they're short. The skulls are found to be short, and then 5 to be long. Okay, so half and half. One half is brachycephalic, and then the other half is dolichocephalic. Okay, so now let's keep reading. Now the great likelihood is that these skulls belong to one and the same race of man. Okay, so once again, one and the same ethnological group or tribe per se. All right, so once again, those most likely are the Picts, and probably that some of them belonged even to members of the very same family. So once again, these are the exact same group of people here. Okay. So now Professor Huxley, in his description of the Catharist remains, refers to the examination by eminent Swiss and German naturalists. Now let's pay attention to what he has to say about what the Swiss and German naturalists that Professor Huxley cites. Okay, so now of many Swiss and German skulls, ancient, right, i.e. aboriginal, who do we just say that the aboriginal people of Germany were? Right, the Germanic tribes, right? Germanic tribes, i.e. the ancestors of the Scandinavians or the Vikings. But let's keep going. So Middle Age or medieval time period. So like the medieval time period started around like 476, and I believe it stretched into the mid to late 1400s. So that's what that's in reference to, Middle Age or medieval time. And then modern. So now when he says modern, he's talking about modern around the time period that he was alive. So relatively modern to his time period. And this person, John Crawford, he lived around like the late 1700s, I believe. He lived around like the late 1700s into the mid to late 1800s, if I'm not mistaken. So his time period was around like the 18th century. So now that's important to remember, because I'm going to very, very briefly mention or reference a document that was written by one of our own founding fathers by the name of Benjamin Franklin, right, who stated that the people of Germany were quote unquote swarthy, okay, swarthy or dark skinned or quote unquote black, as once again I'm about to prove in a little bit here, but he stated that the people of Germany were quote unquote swarthy, but he also referenced a couple other groups like the Swedes and the Russians, who were once again settled that were settled very, very widely by the Scandinavians or the Vikings, right? Because the Vikings would eventually venture out into Russia, right? The quote unquote Rus people or the Rus Vikings. They gave that name of Rus to Russia. That's where you get the name Russia from. And then, of course, the Aboriginal or one of the original Scandinavian tribes, known as the Swedes, or the people of Sweden. Okay, he referenced them as being quote unquote swarthy as well, but that's going to be in a little bit here. So, but let's keep reading. And I gather from it that 3/4 of them come under the designation of short, while the remaining fourth belongs to the long heads. Okay, so 3/4 of the skulls that he found of these German skulls, and then of course Swiss, but we're not looking at that right now. We're looking at the German skulls because we're studying the Germans. So 3/4 or most of the German skulls that he found were short, i.e. brachycephalic, right? Or in other words, people along the lines of the Black Mongolians, right? Like Genghis Khan, Wang Khan, his uncle, and you know the so-called Black Mongolians, Kublai Khan, etc. And then also the Andamanese Islanders, i.e. the Andaman Negritos, okay? So, and then the fourth, or the remaining fourth, were long heads or dolichocephalic, i.e. the Australian Aborigines and the native African San tribesmen, all right? So right here, it should make a little bit more clear here, who the Germans are, right? Are the ancient, as he states right here, the ancient, middle-aged, and relatively modern Germans are, according to these skull designations that Professor Huxley found that John Crawford is referencing here. Okay. So now let's read down a little bit further just to even further bolster what I'm saying. So we'll start from right here. The skulls of the African Negro give a predominance of long skulls or dolichocephalic. Okay. So once again, the African Negro or the San tribesmen, right, or even just quote unquote African people in general, have a dolichocephalic skull index. And then on the other hand, the few skulls of the Andaman Negro that have been examined have turned out to be all short or brachycephalic. Okay? So the Andaman Negroes are once again being associated, just like we read in the, I think it was the Briticana website, that stated that the Andaman Negroes are normally the ones that are associated with the brachycephalic skull index designation. Okay? So just to read on, the only race of man with whom the dolichocephalic or long skull is universally present is the Australian, a people widely different from the rest of mankind, bodily and mentally. So once again, the Australian Aborigines are being associated with the people of, or excuse me, the Australian Aborigines are being associated with the designation of dolichocephalic or long skulled. Okay, so everybody that we've seen thus far who has had these designations applied to them have been so-called black, from the people of Caithness, right? These skulls that were studied in Caithness, I believe from right about here, right? I.e. the Picts, they're being described, or they were described as having short and long skulls, right? And then of course, once again, we've already read how they were described. They were described as having dusky skin, or being quote unquote dark of skin, right? Even going into the Australian Aborigines, who were so-called black, right? The South African San tribesmen, or as this states right here, just outright African Negroes, right? And then the Andaman Negroes, who were associated with brachycephalic, as well as the Black Mongolians, i.e. Kublai Khan, Genghis Khan, etc. Okay, so everybody that we've seen thus far who have had these two skull indexes applied to them are black, or so-called black. Okay, so the Germans, they couldn't have been any different. So now let's go to let's just go to what I referenced a little bit ago about Benjamin Franklin, stating that the quote unquote Germans around his time period were quote unquote swarthy. Let's just read what he has to say real quick, or what he had to say real quick about that. Okay, so now let's start from right here. Why should the Palatine Boers be suffered to swarm into our settlements, and by herding together establish their language and manners to the exclusion of ours? Why should Pennsylvania, founded by the English, become a colony of aliens who will shortly be so numerous as to Germanize us instead of our Anglifying them, and will never adopt our language or customs any more than they can acquire our complexion? Okay, so right here, Benjamin Franklin's already establishing a differentiation in complexion or skin color between the Germans and, as he describes, the people of the quote-unquote Anglo-Saxon descent. So when he says that, he's not talking about the original Anglo-Saxons, because as I've already stated, the original Anglo-Saxons, those were so-called black people. So he's not talking about the original Anglo-Saxons. He's talking about the quote-unquote Anglo-Saxons of that time period, or who they believe to be the quote-unquote Anglo-Saxons of that time period. Okay, so but once again, he's making a differentiation of complexion between the Germans and the Anglo-Saxons, okay? Or the the people who Benjamin Franklin believed to descend from. So now let's go down here and let's read what he has to say even further. So, which leads me to add one remark, that the number of purely white people in the world is proportionately very small. All Africa is black or tawny. Alright, so as we can see, Africa being described as black and then tawny. So now tawny is a word that is used to describe somebody who's, of course, lighter than a quote-unquote dark-skinned black person. So anywhere from like a Patrick Mahomes to like a Kyler Murray, that brother Kyler Murray from the Cardinals, for those of you who watch football, would be somebody who would be described as being tawny. Okay, tawny is just another word for like brown skinned. Okay, so that's what tawny means. So Asia, chiefly tawny. Okay, so Asia, I believe that's in reference to the area that we would call today the quote-unquote Middle East. Okay, so he states Asia chiefly tawny, America exclusive of the newcomers, wholly so. So when he talks about America exclusive of the newcomers, of course he's talking about the Native Americans. Now the Native Americans, especially the natives of South America, those were black people. All right, like the Aztecs and the Mayans and the Incas, those were black people. That's going to be another story for another day. So, but anyway, so now let's hear what he has to say about the people of Europe. And in Europe, the Spaniards, Italians, French, Russians, and Swedes are generally of what we would call a swarthy complexion, as are the Germans also. The Saxons only excepted. So once again, he's talking about the Saxons of that time period, not the original Saxons. But anyway, so once again, he states here that the people of Europe, and then he goes about naming specifics like the Spaniards and the Italians, the French, and then the Russians and the Swedes. So now, as I already stated, the Russians are the people of Russia, particularly around the time period of the Scandinavian expansion into other countries like Russia, and then Iceland, Greenland, Newfoundland or Canada, and then North America, around like the mid to late, I believe, 10th century into the 11th century. The Vikings ventured out into Russia, and they established the name of Russia, which derives from the quote-unquote Rus people, or I believe the descendants of a man by the name of Kievan Rus. Okay, that's where you get the name Russia from. So a lot of the Scandinavians settled in Russia, and then of course we see the Swedes. Right, the Swedes were one of the original Scandinavian kingdoms. So the Swedes are in reference to the descendants of the original Swedes, or the original people that inhabited Sweden. Okay, and of course they're described as being swarthy, and then as are the Germans also. So the Germans are also described as being swarthy. So now, as I've stated all throughout this video series, the word swarthy just means black or dark skinned, or somebody who's a so-called black person. But of course you'll have people who come and state that swarthy just means quote-unquote olive skinned, or somebody who has an olive skinned complexion, and they have like a tan, anywhere from like a tan to like somebody from the Middle East, like a quote-unquote Arab is somebody who's quote-unquote swarthy. But this word swarthy, back during this time period, was a word that mainly meant somebody who was so-called black. All right, so, and even today the term swarthy, it just means dark. It doesn't mean like tan or olive skinned or none of that stuff. It means black or dark. So I'm about to just prove that very, very briefly here. All right, so now we're on the Cambridge Dictionary. So now let's read what the Cambridge Dictionary has to say about the word swarthy. So swarthy, of a person or their skin, dark. Okay, so once again, the term swarthy is being defined as meaning dark, or someone who is dark. Okay, swarthy face complexion, meaning having a dark complexion. Now let's just look down a little bit further here. All right, so now we can see, compare black adjective people. now, now one has to ask themselves, why is the word black being used in association with an adjective, right, or a descriptive word, a word that describes somebody, along with the word people, right? So we can read this as swarthy when it's applied as an adjective to a person means black, right? So swarthy just means a black person, as I already stated. That's all the term swarthy means. It doesn't mean olive skinned and tan colored skin or whatever. It means a black person. That's all the word swarthy means, as we can see right here. Okay, so I just hope a lot of you understand that. And I know I'm gonna still get people on here that try and prove that the term swarthy means something having to do with being olive skinned. That's one of the favorite terms that people like to use, who try and associate swarthy with something else other than being black. But the term swarthy just means black. That's all the word swarthy means. And if I'm not mistaken, the word swart, which is another word that's associated with swarthy, derives from the Norse word or the Scandinavian word savart or savarti. Now the word savart or savarti means, when you look it up, is black. So I mean, you be the judge of that. All right. So they're uniformly described as being dark skinned or swarthy. Okay, as we can see right here, that term swarthy is being applied to all of these people who are listed right here. And then as well, we see the term long skulled popping up once again. So once again, the long skulled term, that's uniformly, as we've seen thus far, or according to the people that we've seen thus far, it's been uniformly associated with people who are quote unquote swarthy or black. All right, so now it should be made obvious that the long skulled people, or people who are identified as having long skulls, are quote unquote negroid or black. So long skulled or dolichocephalic should be it should be proven that it just means somebody who's so-called black. All right. So now let's skip down to right here. So let's start from right here. The second of the two races was the exact opposite to the first. It was the tall, fair, light-haired, blue and gray-eyed, broad-headed people called popularly the Celts, who belonged in speech to the Aryan family, their language finding its affinities in Latin, Greek, Teutonic, Slavonic or Slavic, the Zend of ancient Persia, and the Sanskrit of ancient India. So we see the term broad-headed right here in association with the quote-unquote Celts, but as we can see, they're described as being quote-unquote fair. So what people have to understand is that the Celts were actually descended from the people that I referenced earlier, that being the Iberians. And as I already stated, the Iberians, or as even this stated up here, a little bit up further from where we read, the Iberians were described as being quote unquote swarthy. So if the Iberians were the ancestors of the Celts, then the Celts couldn't have been quote unquote fair. They had to have been quote unquote swarthy, just like the Iberians, right? And as we've seen thus far, just going back once again to the Picts and the Scots, who were part of the Celts, or were two Celtic peoples, they were described as being quote unquote dusky skinned by Gildas, right? So dusky, as we've already seen a myriad of times, or as I've already stated a myriad of times, it just means somebody who's black or somebody who's quote unquote dark skinned. Okay. So if those two Celtic tribes were described as being dusky, then they couldn't have been fair. The Celts couldn't have been quote unquote fair. But let's prove just very, very briefly that the Celts were in fact I should say, the descendants of the Iberians. Let's see that real quick. So now let's read from right about here. So a team from Oxford University has discovered. Let me exit this. All right. So a team from Oxford University has discovered that the Celts, Britain's indigenous people, are descended from a tribe of Iberian fishermen who crossed the Bay of Biscay 6,000 years ago. DNA analysis reveals that they have an almost identical genetic fingerprint to the inhabitants of coastal regions of Spain, whose own ancestors migrated north between 4000 and 5000 BC. The discovery by Brian Sykes, professor of human genetics at Oxford University, will herald a change in the scientific understanding of Britishness. People of Celtic ancestry were thought to have descended from the tribes of Central Europe. Professor Sykes, who is soon to publish the first DNA map of the British Isles, says about 6,000 years ago, Iberians developed ocean-going boats that enabled them to push up the channel. Before they arrived, there were some human inhabitants of Britain, but only a few thousand in number. These people were later subsumed into a larger Celtic tribe. The majority of people in the British Isles are actually descended from the Spanish. So once again, according to this professor right here, Brian Sykes, he states that the Iberians are in fact the ancestors of the Celts. Okay, and this is from quote unquote Oxford University. So that's a very prestigious university. So for this Oxford professor Brian Sykes to state this, there's I'm not going to say that there shouldn't be any doubt that this is true, but this is pretty substantial evidence right here, and it's DNA evidence. So DNA evidence is one of the favorite mechanisms that a lot of the what I call, once again, the quote unquote internet scholars like to use to substantiate their points that try and disapprove the claims of somebody online on one of these internet forums like Quora, who try and state or who even ask whether or not a certain person was so-called black, or if a group of people were so-called black, right? They like to use DNA evidence. So now here's some DNA evidence for you, all right, that the Celts originated from the Iberians. And as we've already seen, the Iberians were described as being quote-unquote swarthy or black, all right, Ethiopian per se. So that should, but once this is going to be a much more in-depth video that I'm gonna do a little bit later on the Celts. It's probably going to be 4 volumes as well. So just look out for that for later on. But let's go on to one last thing here. So what we're about to look at is a completely different perspective, or a completely adverse perspective of what we've been trying to figure out. That being, are the Vikings or the Scandinavians, and even the ancestors of the Vikings and the Scandinavians, that being the Germans, are they quote unquote, or were they really quote unquote so-called black or negroid? Okay, that's what we've been trying to find out. But the perspective that we're about to delve into is the perspective of somebody who has created a multitude of theories that have been used by many quote-unquote white supremacist groups and white nationalist groups to try and substantiate that the original people of Germany, as well as the people of the North, or the quote-unquote Vikings or Scandinavians or what have you, were in fact quote-unquote Caucasian, with blue eyes and red hair and blonde hair and things of that nature, which we're going to see a little bit here that even that isn't true. That the that quote unquote fair skin and red hair and blonde hair, that wasn't that common amongst especially amongst the ancient Germans. But we're going to see that in a little bit here. Okay, but let's just read a little bit about this person right here. His name is William Z Ripley, or William Zabina Ripley. So let's read his little bio right here. So William Zabina Ripley, October 1867 to August 16th, 1941, was an American economist, lecturer and lecturer at Columbia University, professor of economics at MIT, professor of political economy at Harvard University, and racial anthropologist. So he did a lot. Let me see here. Let me just skip down to this sentence right here. So actually, you know what? I'm going to read the whole thing. Ripley was famous for his criticisms of American railroad economics and American business practices in the 1920s and 1930s, and later for his tripartite racial theory of Europe. His work of racial anthropology was later taken up. Fucking microphone, shit. All right, so now let's just look at this one last thing right here. This is going to be from a bit of a different perspective from what we've been seeing so far. So far we've been trying to, of course, prove that the people of Scandinavia, that being the quote-unquote Vikings, and their ancestors, even the quote-unquote Germanic tribes of the Germans, are in fact so-called quote-unquote black people, according to, or as indicated by their skull indexes, right? Because we've been utilizing the Cephalic Index for the last little bit here of this video. But we're just going to look at something from a completely different perspective, from the perspective of somebody who could be deemed as being quote-unquote adverse to the notion that the Scandinavians and the Vikings and even the Germans were so-called black. Okay, the person that I'm about to reference has created a myriad of theories that have been used by quote-unquote white supremacist groups or white nationalist groups, whatever you want to call them, to try and substantiate that the Vikings, of course, were Caucasian with blue eyes and either blonde hair or red hair. Okay, but of course not so-called black. But let's read a little bit about this person right here, William Z Ripley, or William Zabina Ripley. Let's read a little bit about him real quick. So William Zabina Ripley was an American economist, lecturer at Columbia University, professor of economics at MIT, professor of political economy at Harvard University, and racial anthropologist. Ripley was famous for his criticisms of American railroad economics and American business practices in the 1920s and 1930s, and later for his tripartite racial theory of Europe. His work of racial anthropology was later taken up by racial physical anthropologists, eugenicists, and white supremacists. And once again, his theories were heavily regarded and revered amongst the quote-unquote white supremacist groups or circles, and was considered a valid academic work at the time, although today it is considered to be a prime example of scientific racism. Okay, so a lot of the theories that this man, William Z. Ripley, proposed ended up springing forth offshoots, such as the theory of quote-unquote Nordicism, which was created by a man by the name of Madison Grant. And the theory of Nordicism is basically the theory that the quote-unquote Nordic race, i.e. the Teutonic people, or the people of the quote-unquote northern race, right, like the Scandinavians or what have you, are the are the superior race per se of man, and that they're a endangered race. Okay, so silly theories like that derive from this man, William Z. Ripley. Okay, but he was a very, very big user or proponent of the Cephalic Index as well. That was one of his main mechanisms for proving, or trying to prove, or at least attempting to prove, that the quote-unquote Teutonic people or Nordic people were in fact Caucasian, right? And he was a very, very big proponent of using a lot of the designations that Thomas Huxley would use as well. Like one of them was Zach and Throy. I believe another one was like Melancroy, which is just another word for somebody who's Caucasian, but they have slightly tan skin or slightly dark skin. So it's like somebody who would be referred to as being quote unquote olive skinned, is what a quote unquote Zachanthroid person, or excuse me, a Melancroid person would look like or would be described as. And then, as I stated, Zachanthroid, that's just the outright Caucasian person. So he used a lot of those designations as well, if I'm not mistaken. It was either William Z. Ripley or Madison Grant would use a lot of those designations as well to try and substantiate that, once again, the German people and even the Scandinavians were so-called Caucasian. But let's just see how Mr. William Z. Ripley defines the skull index of the Teutonic or German people, because Teutonic was just another word for quote-unquote German. Let's see how he defines the skull index of the Teutonic or German people and what that's going to entail. So let's start from right about here. So Ripley based his conclusions about race on his attempts to correlate anthropometric data with geographical data, especially using the Cephalic Index. So that's what we've been using this entire time, the Cephalic Index. So let's keep reading. Which at the time was considered a reliable anthropomorphic measure. Based on these measurements and other socio-geographical data, Ripley classified Europeans into three distinct races. Teutonic, i.e. German, members of the northern race, i.e. the Scandinavians, right, were long-skulled or dolichocephalic, tall in stature and possessed pale eyes and skin. So, once again, all throughout our investigation of the Cephalic Index, we've seen that dolichocephalic equals quote-unquote black people, right, from the Australian Aborigines to the South African San tribesmen to the African Negroes, as John Crawford stated in his little excerpt that we read, to the Iberians, right, the ancestors of the Celts, who were described as being swarthy or Ethiops or Ethiopian, whatever. All of those people that we've read about so far have been described as being quote-unquote swarthy or black. And they were all quote-unquote long-skulled or dolichocephalic. Okay? So according to this person, the Teutonics or the Germans, right, they had a dolichocephalic skull, or they were long-skulled. So what is he really trying to say here? What is he really trying to say here? Even though, according to him, they're quote-unquote pale-skinned and have pale eyes, obviously that can't be the case, since all the dolichocephalic people, for the most part, are uniformly all so-called black people. So this is why it's important to have knowledge of terms and meanings of terms and words, like I stated earlier about the N-word. It's important to have knowledge about the meanings and the definitions of these different terms, so that we can look at something like this and we can look at this word in association with somebody who has a completely different view or an adverse view of certain historical narratives or certain historical things from us, right? Such as this man William Z. Ripley, who his theories were actively used by quote-unquote racist or white supremacist groups, right, during that time period. So, we can look at words like this that are being used by somebody like this, and we can now identify what this word means in its correct context, because now we have knowledge of who this word was applied to, or who this word was in reference to. Okay, so even according to this person, even though it's not outright, even according to this person, dolichocephalic is in reference to the Teutonic or the German people, right? Let's look at who this is. So the Nordic race was a racial concept, so that's in reference to, as it says right here, the Anglo-Saxons, Germanic peoples, right, i.e. the ancestors of the so-called Vikings, right, the These are the people who are being referenced here as quote unquote Teutonic, right? And so as we once again, he's stating here that the Germans or the Germanic people are in fact long-skulled or dolichocephalic, okay, or dolichocephalic. So that should be enough right here to prove that once again the people of Germany or the Aboriginals of Germany were in fact the same people that we've been seeing thus far, who have also had that moniker of dolichocephalic applied to them, or dolichocephalic applied to them, who have all been described as being swarthy or dark skinned or just outright black, okay? So, but let's look at even more genetic evidence that proves that the ancient people of Germany were not fair skinned, right? Like this person says right here. He states that they had pale eyes and pale skin, but we're going to look at DNA evidence that proves that the ancient Germans, once again, were not fair-skinned, and that they didn't have blonde hair and, even red hair and blue eyes. Okay, let's look at that real quick. Zoom in real quick. Alright, so as we can see, the title states ancient Germans weren't so fair. Okay. So now let's just read this little caption right here. So this girl's ancestors, of course, assuming that this girl is the ancestor of the Aboriginal Germans, which of course, she's not. As I already stated, the people of Europe that reside out there in Europe today, they are not the descendants of the ancient Europeans. But anyway, so this girl's ancestor may have had darker skin that didn't burn so easily, ancient DNA suggests. So when it states didn't burn so easily, so that's in reference to the theory that a lot of people also like to use about why ancient people were quote unquote darker skinned or quote unquote dark skinned. They'll usually try and associate that with them having skin that was susceptible to becoming darker under the sun. So they basically use the sun as a substantial mechanism to try and prove why the ancient people were darker, or why they were described as being dark, right? So it's always some sort of excuse or some sort of mechanism that's used to try and explain away why the ancient people were described as being dark, right? Or why the ancient people of a certain country that's mainly inhabited by people who are quote unquote Caucasian were described anciently as being dark, right, or black even. So let's read this article right here. Let's start from right about here. You know what? Let's start from the beginning. So researchers may be able to make more accurate reconstructions of what ancient humans looked like with the first ever use of ancient DNA to determine hair and skin color from skeletal remains. The research was presented today at an international ancient DNA conference in Brisbane, Australia by German anthropologist Dr. Diane Schmidt of the University of Göttingen. So she's, it seems as though she's German, because that sounds like a German name for a university, but anyway. So she said her research may also help to identify modern-day murderers and their victims. So that's not relevant. Okay, 3,000 years ago, nobody was doing painting and there was no photography. We do not know what people looked like. She said most images in museums and books were derived from comparisons with living people from the same region. So she's basically acknowledging what I just stated, that it's assumed that the people who reside in certain countries today are the descendants of the ancient people. It's presumed that they're the descendants of those ancient people that derived from that area, or that came from that area and that first settled in that area. But as we're about to see, that's not the case. And even this person right here is basically kind of sort of disapproving that notion, because she's saying that it's assumed, i.e., people just basically assume, just because they see a certain group of people out there today, or out in a certain country today, that they're the natives of that country, right? Like if you see a country that's mainly comprised of quote unquote Caucasians, you're just going to assume that they're the ancient, or that they're the descendants of the ancient settlers of that land, and that the ancient settlers of that land must have been Caucasian as well. But that's not the case, as we're about to see in a minute. All right, so. And then, of course, she gives the example about Africa. So, for example, when we make a reconstruction of people from Africa, we think that they had dark skin and dark hair, she said, but there's no real scientific information. It's just a guess. It's mostly imagination. Actually, no, it's not, because many ancient historians have stated that the people of Africa have always been quote unquote Negroid or black. All right, so obviously this isn't true right here. She's basically stating that because there's no scientific information to substantiate that the people of Africa were quote unquote dark or black or what have you, that means that that is just purely speculation, that those people were so-called black, but that's not the case. But let's just read what she has to say even further. So she said this had meant, for example, that the reconstruction of Neanderthals had changed over time. Oh, we don't need to read that. Okay, so now let's read this. Okay, yeah, let's read the stuff that's under this caption right here: genetic markers for hair color. So, in research for her recently completed PhD, Schmidt built on research from the fields of dermatology and skin cancer that have found genetic markers for traits such as skin and hair color in modern humans. In particular, Schmidt relied on the fact that different mutations known as single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs, in the melanocortin receptor 1 gene are responsible for skin and hair color. This set of SNPs that tells you that a person was a redhead, and a different set of markers tell you they were fair-skinned. She extracted DNA from ancient human bones as old as 3,000 years old from 3 different locations in Germany and looked for these SNPs. Her findings suggest that red hair and fair skin was very uncommon among ancient Germans. So now let's just look at this real quick. So fair skin was uncommon among the ancient was uncommon amongst the ancient Germans. She says very uncommon. So now when you look at the people of Germany today, they look like this little girl right here, right? Pale with quote unquote blue eyes and blonde hair and traits of that nature, physical traits of that nature. But according to this person, that was not the case amongst the ancient Germans, right? I.e., the people known as the Germanic Tribes, right? The first settlers of Germany. That was very uncommon amongst those people. And as we've already seen, the Germanic tribes, or the ancient people of Germany, those were the ancestors of the Vikings, or the Scandinavians. So you guys starting to see what I've been saying this whole entire time? That the Scandinavians, or the Vikings, were in fact people of color. Okay? As well as their ancestors. They were also people of color. Even down to Benjamin Franklin's day, or Benjamin Franklin's era, around like the early to mid 1700s. The Germans, who were described by Benjamin Franklin as being swarthy, those were black people. Okay, so even all the way down to then, the so-called blacks of Germany, they maintained their presence in Germany. Okay. So once again, this person right here is just revealing even further that the Germans, that the ancient Germans were in fact, they were people of color, right? Because if they didn't have fair skin, it's obvious that they must have had some sort of skin pigmentation within their within their skin tone, right? Right? They must have had some sort of variation of quote unquote melanin in their skin, right? And as we've been able to see thus far through numerous different mechanisms or methods of proving that the ancient Germans were and that the Scandinavians were quote unquote black, we've been able to see that they were a lot of the times the Scandinavians, especially the Danes, right, who were descended from the northern Germanic tribe known as the Danes, right? They were described in a myriad of chroniclings, right, like the Annales Cambriae. Remember, in 987, the term Negris was used to describe Gothred, who was the son of a Danish king or a Jutlandish king, right? He led an army of black men in 987 in the island of Wales, right, against the Welsh in 987. They were described as being quote unquote Negris, right? And we've already proven that Negris is just another word for black or dark. All right, so as we've already seen a number of times, these people are so-called black. These are black people. All right, so now let's just read a little bit further down though, to see what else she has to say. So out of a total of 26 people analyzed, Schmidt found only one person with red hair and fair skin, a man from the Middle Ages. So she took a census, or she analyzed 26 people. I'm assuming that some of those people must have also derived from the Middle Ages as well, because she found somebody from the Middle Ages who had quote unquote fair skin, right? So she must have been examining ancient and even into the Middle Age, or middle-aged people that she had found. And she states right here, or it states right here, that she only found one person out of the 26 people that she analyzed. She found only one person that had red hair and fair skin. Only one person. Okay? So, but then, of course, in order to explain all this away, she states all the other people had more UV tolerant skin that tans easily. So once again, using the excuse that they were dark because of sun exposure or sun radiation or what have you. But we've already seen enough evidence to substantiate that that's not true. That these people were quote unquote black. They were so-called, they were so-called black naturally. They weren't darker. They didn't get darker because of the UV rays from the sun or what have you. So that's not true. So, but let's read down a little bit further. So she said she was excited when she colored in the faces that once covered the skulls and had developed a kind of personal relationship with them. So once again, she's coloring in these faces of these skulls that she found, because this woman knows that they were black. I promise you, she knows. But she's just having to use this UV tolerant stuff to try and disapprove, or to try and steer away from the fact that these people could have possibly been so-called black. But I promise you, she knows that these people were black. She knows. But yeah, so that's just more. That's just even more evidence to substantiate that these people were so-called black. That the Germans, as well as the Scandinavians, as well as the especially the people of Denmark, who we've already seen were the Dub Genti, right, or black Gentiles or black foreigners, right? Dub Gaul, another name for them. Right, so we've already been able to see that those people were black. Those were so-called black people, as their names suggested. Okay.